Greetings and welcome. We are in Senior English B, and we're going to spend now a little bit of time with the poet W.H. Auden. You should be on page 1171. Go ahead and jot down dates real quickly. Interestingly, if you put his death date at 1973, you can see that we're actually moving now closer to a time when you were born, right? So you can kind of get a sense of this, that this is a poet. Notice the range of dates from 1907. The second thing I want to point out to you is that Auden, under literary analysis on 1170, Auden is going to be working with allegory and the pastoral. You'll want to make sure both of those are written down at 2B. And those vocabulary words that keep coming up on the exam that one or two of you continue to struggle with, this explains why some of you are scoring a little bit lower on your exams. So study these vocab words, all right? I want to start on page 1173 with a little bit of background information at the top of 1173. Read it with me. The 1930s, and you want to write this down. The 1930s, a decade of economic collapse, political turmoil, obviously ending with the world going into another great war. Complex concerns, obviously, for this period. Reflected in the poems of the, you want to write it down, Auden Circle. I'm on the top of page 1173. Auden Circle. In other words, a group of poets that hung out with Auden. And you can see that list there, Spender, McGee, C.D. Lewis. Political urgencies of the time. What are they? Dash, see them. Opposition to fascism. Fascism. The movement from social justice for the working classes shaped much of the poetry the Auden Circle wrote then. Okay? Obviously, along with social concerns, each of the poets share a deep sense of a specifically poetic vocation to make something happen in language. So you're doing two games at one time, if you will. We're going to turn now to the first of the two Auden offerings that we have. But before I go there, I want to point out that Auden has a tremendous respect for T.S. Eliot. And in one way, Auden is a lot like Eliot. Here's how. Auden does not end up the citizen of the country he was born into. T.S. Eliot, you'll remember, ended up a British citizen born in America. Auden ends up an American citizen, write this in your notes, an American citizen born in England. Okay? Which is why last year, in your junior anthology as an American author, you read a famous Auden poem to an unknown citizen. And then here, this year now, you'll look at a couple more Auden poems. The first of these is a tribute poem. That's what you want to call it as. And I'm going to help you, and then we're going to read this thing together, okay? So notice this poem starting on 1173 going on to 1175 is divided up into three parts. Do you see it? So again, at level 1, just write down number 1, skip a few lines. Number 2, skip a few lines. Number 3, skip a few lines. And let me help you with the schemata here before we actually read the poem itself. First of all, it's a tribute poem. Celebrating who? Who is Yeats? Write down one poem that Yeats wrote that you know about. What's one poem that Yeats wrote that you know about? Do you remember? That is no country for old men, the young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations at their song, the salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas, fish, flesh, or fowl, commend all summer long, whatever is begotten, born, and dies, caught in that sensual music, all neglect, monuments of an aging intellect. Right, sailing to Byzantium. Yeats, one of the greatest poets, and Auden recognizing it. So when Yeats dies, Auden will write a poem to him in tribute. Okay? There are three parts to this poem. Let's write it down. In part 1, so you can just see this on the exam, they're going to ask you about the different parts of the poem. So if you write this down, it's a good way to prepare. Part 1, Auden is going to describe Yeats's all too human death. It's kind of tragic. And the gap it leaves behind. When you lose a great voice, it's hard to replace him. I don't know you ever replace the voice of Yeats. Part 2. Auden addresses Yeats directly, as if he's still alive. He's going to reassure him of his poetry's enduring qualities. In other words, people will be talking about you and reading your poetry long after you're gone. Part 3. Addressed to Earth and to as well a generic poet. It focuses in the third part on the nature, you want to write this down, the nature of poetry. Although it, quote, makes nothing happen, end quote, poetry teaches joy in the human condition. Okay? So you got 3 parts to this poem. Part 1, wow, no way to replace him. Part 2, directly spoken to Yeats, you're going to be remembered. Part 3 talks about the value of poetry. It doesn't actually do anything, it just does everything. Which is an interesting way to think about poetry. At 3B, 1 or 2 of you will realize that as much as you could care less about poetry, funny thing, when you're having a terrible day, you have a tendency to turn on a certain kind of music, often with a certain kind of lyrics. Those lyrics are poetry. If you'll think about it, most of the time when you're really unhappy or you're really happy, you have a tendency to refer to poetry. You don't think of it as poetry, you think of it as more music or song, right? But nonetheless, could ask the question, why is poetry such a big deal? Let's now listen to the poem. We're going to read it. We're going to have a professional reader for us in 1173. Here we go. Just follow along.
Memory of W.B. Yeats by W.H. Auden. 1. He disappeared in the dead of winter. The brooks were frozen, the airports almost deserted, and snow disfigured the public statues. The mercury sank in the mouth of the dying day. Oh, all the instruments agree, the day of his death was a dark, cold day. Far from his illness, the wolves ran on through the evergreen forests. The peasant river was untempted by fashionable quays. By mourning tongues, the death of the poet was kept from his poems. But for him, it was his last afternoon as himself, an afternoon of nurses and rumors. The provinces of his body revolted. The squares of his mind were empty. Silence invaded the suburbs. The current of his feeling failed. He became his admirers. Now he is scattered among 100 cities and wholly given over to unfamiliar affections. To find his happiness in another kind of wood and be punished by another code of conscience. The words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living.
That's an interesting line, huh?
But in the importance and noise of tomorrow, when the brokers are roaring like beasts on the floor of the bourse, and the poor have the sufferings to which they are fairly accustomed, and each in the cell of himself is almost convinced of his freedom, a few thousand will think of this day as one thinks of a day when one did something slightly unusual. Oh, all the instruments agree, the day of his death was a dark, cold day. 2. You were silly like us. Your gift survived it all. The parish of rich women, physical decay, yourself, mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. Now Ireland has her madness and her weather still, for poetry makes nothing happen. It survives in the valley of its saying where executives would never want to tamper. It flows south from ranches of isolation and the busy griefs, raw towns that we believe and die in. It survives, a way of happening, a mouth. 3. Earth, receive an honored guest. William Yeats is laid to rest. Let the Irish vessel lie, emptied of its poetry. Time that is intolerant of the brave and innocent, and indifferent and a weak to a beautiful physique, worships language and forgives everyone by whom it lives, pardons cowardice, conceit, lays its honors at their feet. Time with this strange excuse pardon Kipling and his views, and will pardon Paul Claudel, pardons him for writing well. In the nightmare of the dark, all the dogs of Europe bark, and the living nations wait, each sequestered in its hate. Intellectual disgrace stares from every human face, and the seas of pity lie locked and frozen in each eye. Follow, poet, follow right to the bottom of the night. With your unconstraining voice, still persuade us to rejoice. With the farming of a verse, make a vineyard of the curse. Sing of human unsuccess in a rapture of distress. In the deserts of the heart, let the healing fountain start. In the prison of his days, teach the free man how to praise.
I want to start at 2B. We'll just make a couple of quick observations. What do you find is different in regards to these different parts? Like, for example, at 2B, rhetoric. How is part 2 different from part 3 in terms of length of line, rhythm, meter, all that kind of stuff? Do you see a difference? I mean, you can see it laying on the page, right? Part 2 obviously looks different from part 3, right? Notice how Auden is going to play a game where in all 3 of these parts he plays with different line length, different stanza constructions, right? Second question. Of the 3 parts of the poem, which one do you find the most compelling and why? Okay. The third is, for many readers, very compelling, but why? Jot down in your notes why. Why is the third so interesting? What does he say about poetry that matters? In the bottom of the night, with your unconstraining voice, still persuade us to rejoice. In other words, what? In the middle of nasties, still try and find some way to be what? Right, be happy. Have some sense of joy. Finally, 3B question. For you, what's the most famous person you know who has died in your lifetime, who everyone really genuinely missed? Jot it down. What is for you? Maybe songs were written about the person. Maybe a poem was written about the person. And again, I want you to do it in your lifetime. So you don't get to say people like John F. Kennedy or somebody like that, because obviously it's not your lifetime. Who is the most famous person who's died in your lifetime? Write that down. And are you familiar with any kind of poems or songs or movies or anything that was made as a tribute to that person?